Okay, good morning. So we are doing today Yud Amud Aleph. We are towards the bottom of Yud Amud Beis, about 10 lines up. We're continuing discussing psukim from Shoftim, and the pasuk that we are discussing today is V'ato hishamarino b'al tishti yayin v'sheicha b'al toichli kol tamei. The pasuk there says, as part of the instructions that the Malach gave to Manoach and his wife. We don't get her name actually as a matter of pshat. She's called Eshes Manoach there, even though her husband is made to follow her. So over there, the instructions were, even though the husband wanted to get a refresh and make sure that because he didn't 100% trust his wife, the pasuk is clear that their son to be born was not to be drinking wine and beer, etc., and not to eat any tame. So the Gemara asks, "My kol tame." What is it referring to when it says that this child is not supposed to eat kol tame? He's not supposed to eat impure foods. Besu ad hashta dvarim tameim ka'achla. Does that mean that until then they weren't keeping kosher? They were eating, shkatzim, vermasim, and all sorts of, impure things? Says the Gemara. No. Amr Yitzchak Debei Rab Ami Devarim Ha'asurim B'Nazir. It's referring to things that were usher to a nazir. In other words, when it says in pasuk Al Toichli Kol Tamei, it doesn't mean to eat impure foods, but to eat impure foods that would be impure to a nazir. Meaning, you can't have grapes or seeds of grapes or that raisins. That's what would be usher to a nazir. For that nazir would be a davar tamei. It's not that it's a davar tamei inherently or objectively. It's to the nazir it would be, and so therefore, what the instructions were just telling them that you have to lay off these foods entirely. Your son is going to be a nazir, needs to avoid them absolutely. Continues the Gemara. Vayivaka Elokim es hamachtesh asher belechi. So the background over here is that Shimshon at one point used the jawbone of a donkey to kill a lot of Pelishtim. And the lechi, the lechi, the jawbone, right, lechayayim, right, lechayayim. So the jawbone that he used obviously is not a sword, and he used it to kill 1,000 Pelishtim. And after that, he was mamish dying of thirst, and Hashem opens up the Machtesh. If you ever go to Israel, in the south of Israel, a place called Machtesh Rimon. Machtesh is a hollow. It's a big, like a big hollow in the ground. So Hashem opened it up in order to be able to provide him water, but the pasuk is making sort of a play on it. That place where he had used the jawbone to kill 1,000 Pelishtim, that's the place where Hashem provides him the water. Otherwise, he would have died of thirst. So the Gemara is Rashi understand. I'll first tell you what Rashi, then we'll tell you the Marsha, and then I'll tell you what I think. So the Gemara dashes like this. What does it mean Hashem sort of cleaved open this hollow in the place of Lechi? Amr Rabbi Yitzchak Debei Rabbi. I'm sorry, Amr Rabbi Yitzchak Debei Rabbi Ami. Who Eva Ladavar Tameh, he desired, he had a taiva for something Tameh. Therefore, his life was sort of hung up in a davar tameh. So what does that mean? Rashi understands who Eva Ladavar Tameh. He wanted to marry a non-Jew, non-Jewish woman, right? He had first there was a woman in Timnas, then there was the Zaina, then there was Delilia. So, you know, that was his as we mentioned yesterday, his chasing after his eyes, and therefore, therefore his life was sort of held in the balance on a davar tamei. Rashi explains, right? The jawbone of the donkey is what he used to kill all 1,000 Pelishtim. Who, if not for that, he would have died in thirst. So, as the Marsha already notes, I don't really understand Rashi. Like, what is Rashi saying? The jawbone of the donkey is not what he used to help him from thirst. That jawbone of the donkey he used to kill 1,000 Pelishtim. Then he was very tired. He puts down the jawbone and he's dying of thirst. And in that machpesh, in that hollow, in that area, the place that's now called Lechi, there Hashem gives him to drink. So it's not really connected anymore to the jawbone of the donkey, and the fact that that place is now known as the jawbone of the, because of what he had done with the jawbone of the donkey. But it's not really such a obvious connection between the davar tameh that Rashi is trying to say from the jawbone of the donkey that his life is toila in the thirst. The thirst has nothing to do with it. The reason that Rashi is pushing this is because the pasuk is that is quoted by Rabbi Yitzchak the Rabbi Ami is "Ve'yavakel Elokim es hamachzis asher balechi," which is talking about the thirst. So the Mashal has his way as well, and he tries to explain the pasuk. I'll tell you what I think is the pasuk shot on of what Rabbi Yitzchak the Rabbi Ami is trying to say, which is who evil davar tameh, right? He was lusting after these Philistine women. The figure of Nidl Chaim is davar tameh. Therefore, his life was also sort of held in the balance with the davar tameh, meaning the same way that he used the Philistine women maybe in ways that weren't the most appropriate. He also, effectively had to save his life with a davar tameh. He had to use the jawbone of a donkey, which is not a kosher animal, in order to be able to save his life. That's how I would explain it. The problem with the pshat, which I'm freely admitting, is the pasuk that's opening it up, is talking about after he already used the jawbone to kill the 1,000 Plishtim, and he has now put it down and he's dying of thirst, and Hashem opens up this machtesh, this hollow there, and gives him to drink, this hollow in the rock, which, as I say, is right after it happened. So it's sort of the wrong pasuk to quote. That's not the pasuk you would have quoted to bring out the point that he was sort of using the jawbone, which is a davar tameh, to save himself from the 1,000 plishtim. I could have quoted a different pasuk for that. So we'll leave that as a bit of a tzarchi and not 100% clear. Batoch Ruach Hashem, the next pasuk over there in Shoftim deals with the fact that after Shimshon is born, there becomes now a spirit of Hashem again in the Jewish people. The Maharsha points out, but we never called Shimshon a Navi. So what do you mean by Batoch Ruach Hashem? Now there's like a spirit of Hashem in the area, but Shimshon is not exactly a Navi. So what do you mean when we say that there was a spirit of Hashem? Says the Gemara, Rav Chama Bar Chanina. What we mean is that the nevuah of Yaakov Avinu was chal, meaning it finally took off. Yaakov Avinu gave a nevuah 1,000 years earlier, where he had said to Dan, he done nachash al derech shefipon al yarach hanoshech beisuz, right? Ve'ipol rachavay achar l'shu'asacha kivisi Hashem. The Yaakov Avinu's nevuah, as Rashi notes over there, based upon the Midrashim, was a reference to Shimshon, a Gibor, and Yaakov's nevuah did not take place for Dan until that time. What does it mean? Because what did Yaakov Avinu say? Amar Cham Rachina Cholston of us Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu's nevuah is finally chal. The Slivi no nachash ale derek. That uh, uh, what is done compared to which animal? The serpent. He's like the serpent on the road. We're going to see the Maharsha notes over here, but we're going to see later on in the Gemara one of the examples. It's pointed out both in the Medrash Rabbah and of course in the Yerushalmi here in Sotah. Many similarities between Shimshon and the Nachash, a serpent. One of the things that we're going to see right here on Yud Amud Aleph, I'll say now, is that according to Chazal, Shimshon may have very well been lame. He may have very well been lame in both of his legs, meaning he superhuman strength, but he may have actually not had much use from his legs. If that's the case, then the Yerushalmi notes, and Maharsha points out as well, then it's a beautiful comparison to a snake. Forget what Chazal say that the snake once had hands and feet and it loses it as a result of the sin by Chava. Just think about the snake that you normally see. How does the snake move? It doesn't have legs. It has this incredible, uncanny ability to be able to move on the ground without actually having any external appurtenances. It can nevertheless still shimmy along. So if, in fact, Shimshon is lame, and even though he has no usage of his legs, he still has the ability to move along. That will be a very beautiful comparison or apt comparison between Shimshon to the Nachash and why you see the Yaakov Avinu's Nevuah is finally Chal. Huh? Yeah. So I think what you're trying to say is that the Nachash is flawed, and maybe there's some flaws in Shimshon that we are highlighting over here. But obviously, Nachash, even though he's flawed, he's still very smart. Um, yeah, I'm not sure that that is one of the comparisons that Chazal make, but nevertheless, it is definitely Shimshon. All of the characters, all of the shaykhs that we meet, um, the ones that we get more than like one or two psukim out of, Yiftach, Shimshon. They're colorful, right? The lives are not, not so simple. All right, continues the Gemara. The Fa'amay b'machane Dan, right? So the spirit of Hashem, the end of that pasuk, again was sort of tolling the in the encampment of Dan. Amr v'tzeder b'ami melamed shoyis hashchina mekaskeses lefonav kizoi. The Shechina was sort of like jangling in front like a bell. Over here it says that they were getting the spirit of Hashem in the camp of Dan. And over there it says about the by the Mishkan, right, by the mill that the Kohen Gadol wore, right. So there was on the bottom of it, right, there was a bell, then a pomegranate, then a bell, right, and as he would walk, right, before like Kodesh, you would hear it. It would come before there was a noise, right? That's the appropriate way. You don't barge it unannounced, and so the same. That's how we see that there's a connection between Lefa'amai and Pa'amain. And what that's telling us is that when Shimshon was born, again, the sort of the Shechina was jangling along in Machane Dan. The end of that pasuk is Bein Saro, Bein Eshtael, which are most likely places, as the Maharsha notes that these are probably cities in Yehuda. It's where we have them other places in Tanakh. This is mentioned, but why is it mentioning it over here? Remember, we're talking about Machane Dan, and we're talking about Sarah Eshtael. Doesn't sound like we necessarily be talking about the cities of Yehuda. Amar Rav Asi, Sarah Eshtael Shnei Harim Gedalim Hayu. Sarah and Eshtael were two mountains. V'akaran Shimshon v'toichanan zebazeh. And Shimshon sort of was so strong that he took these mountains and ground them together. So again, he didn't destroy cities of Yehuda, but he did destroy these mountains, perhaps in some sort of a feat or show of strength. Not sure. Okay, the pasuk then says, "V'hu yachel la'ishes Yisrael." Then Shimshon started to come along and to save the Jewish people. Amma Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina. As we turn the page now to Yonam and Aleph, so Rabbi Chama Rabbi Chanina said, "Huchal shavuasai shel Avimelech." So, what does it mean that he came along to save the Jewish people? The lashon of the pasuk is Yachel. Right, we just had it in Parshas Matos. Lo yachel devarai kol yotzim piv yaseh. Right, you shouldn't, when you make an oath, you shouldn't waste your words. Right, you make an oath, you should keep to what you say. You shouldn't let it be frivolous. So the lashon of kol or chal can be a lashon of like making secular, of making it a halal, making it not happen. So the pasuk is being darshaned as a play on words. On the one hand, chal could be like it's finally chal, right? Like we said before about the words of Yaakov. Chol son of Yaakov, it's finally chal. Right? But it could also be like chulin, like it becomes secularized, it becomes not relevant anymore. So the Gemara is darshaning, "V'hu yachel la'hishias Yisrael." It was finally chal to be saving the Jews. The tchila, bitchila, right? Bitchila, right? What it can mean from the beginning. So on the one hand, it means that in the now finally the Jewish people were beginning to be saved. But the Gemara is playing on it by saying, "Amar Kabarech Hanina, Hu chal shavuos yesh Avimelech." The oath of Avimelech has finally been denuded. It's been sort of desanctified, desacralized. It is no longer chal. The shvu of Avimelech that Yitzchak had done in Tishka Li Lunini Lunaki Kachas Asher Sisim Lachem Tasei Madi I'm sorry, that Avram had done with Avimelech, and then Yitzchak again had done with Avimelech. That shvua is no longer. Rashi points out. Let's look at Rashi for a second. The lashon of that the shvua is batal is lashon lo yachel devara. It comes from that what we say in Parashas Matos. Why is the shvua that the Jews had with Avimelech batal? Lefi shehem avru ala shvua tchilam, because the Pelishtim were over on the shvua beforehand. What do you mean they were over on the shvua beforehand? Because they mistreated the Jewish people. They were fighting with the Jews all the time. Right? In fact, the Jews, when they're telling Shimshon not to bother the Pelishtim, they said, "Look, we work for the Pelishtim. We're under their thumb. Stop messing around with the Pelishtim." And Shimshon essentially has to tell them, "Okay, listen, don't worry about me. Like, give me up to the Pelishtim. Don't worry, I'll take care of myself." But that's how much under the thumb the Jews were. So this opens up for me a very fascinating topic, and that is the topic of our shvuas interdependent on one another, right? Our shvuas intertwined with one another. Here, the Gemara is very clear that the shvu of Avimelech, the Jews had with the Pelishtim, was interdependent on the shvua that the Jews, Avram, Yitzchak, they had made a shvu with Avimelech, but the shvuas are interdependent. We're not going to start up with you, and you're not going to start up with us. Your descendants did start up with us, so now we're going to start up with you. So the Gemara is darshaning. He starts to save the Jews. He starts to save the Jews by saying that the shua that was valid from us against the Pelishtim, we're not going to fight with them, is no longer relevant. Why? Because the Pelishtim were not supposed to fight with us, and they are, so we can fight with them. Pasha. There's a Medrash Tanchuma in Parashat Dvarim in Parak Gimel. The Medrash Tanchuma says that Yoav went to go fight a war. He went to go fight a war with the descendants of Aram Naharayim. Yishahalach Yoav lihilachim im Aram Naharayim yatzu l'krasei. So the people from Aram Naharayim went to go fight with Yoav, or to go meet him after he's going to fight with them. Amrulai atami b'nei banu shel Yaakov Avinu, lanu b'nei banu shel Lavan. You're from Yaakov Avinu. We're from Lavan. What did the pasuk say in the end of Parashat Vayetze? Pasuk says in the end of Parashat Vayetze, the Yaakov and Lavan made an oath. One and another. One called it Galei, one called it Yigarsa Adusa. And what is that oath that Yaakov and Lavan made? That they're not going to cross this line and go fight against one another. So how could Yoav go fight against Aram Naharaim? Isn't there an oath that says that they're not allowed to? B'harei Tanai Shalem Kayim. The Sival Eid Hagal Zev Eid Al Matzeva Kishama Yoav Chazer Eitel David. So Yoav doesn't know what to do. He's going to fight a war against Aram Naharaim. He doesn't know what to do. So what does he do? He comes back to David. Amar loy. So he says to David, Ma'ato Emer. All right, tonight Shvuas Yaakov. Miyad Yeshiva Sanhedrin Shushan Edus Alamed. So they brought together the Sanhedrin to make a decision what should be done in this case. Limduva Amru. The Sanhedrin said, Ve'emes Kachay tonight. The Sanhedrin said, you know, there was a tonight that we're not allowed to fight with the people from around that rank because they're descendants of Lavan. That is true. However, El Shehem Arvu Tchila. But they violated it first. Or how did they violate it? Bilam Arash Lekach Amar. What did Bilam Arash? Now, Bilam, is he from Aram Naharaim, or is he actually from Midian? Not 100% clear. It's a huge machlokes in the Bishainim. The psukim are seemingly contradictory. On the one hand, Bilam says about himself, Min Aram Naharaim, and Min Aram Yancheni Balag Melech Maya. Balag took me from Aram to come curse the Jews. On the other hand, and it also says about Bilam, Mipisar Aram Naharaim Lekalaleka. The Pasuk says that the Jews were saved by Hashem, despite the fact that Bilam, who was hired, was from Pisar Aram Naharaim, who was hired to curse you. It sounds like you have at least a couple of psukim that say that Bilam is from Aram Naharaim. However, there are also psukim that seem to indicate that Bilam is from Midian. Which one is correct? It's not clear. This measure is certainly going according to the idea that Bilam is from Aram Naharaim. Otherwise, this measure doesn't make any sense. So, says the measure that the Sanhedrin said that Bilam was from Aram. He was hired by Balak Melech Moav to go curse the Jews, and therefore, so they started up with us. Since the Sanhedrin said that since they started up, we no longer have to keep the oath. They went back up to Aram Naharaim and they killed them. And that's what it means in Pasuk Shneim about Tzoyses Aram Narayim Besaram Tzoyva. And that is in fact what happened. The Medrash continues and says, Shaba Yoav Lilachim Im Aram Amdalim Ne'edim V'Amla Kacham Lachem Kosh Baruch Atzkarubam. Yeah. So what we see from this Medrash is that there was a notion that the oaths were interdependent of one another, and that was the situation of the oath that Yaakov Avinu made to Lavan. There is a Gemara in Ksubas Kufir Aleph. The Gemara tells us about the famous three oaths. And what are the famous three oaths? The Jews are not supposed to be Oila Kachayma in Eretz Yisrael. That the Jews are not supposed to be rebelling against the nations. And the third oath is that the nations are not supposed to be Mishabed B'Yisrael Yoysim Midai. They're not supposed to be enslaving the Jews more than what's normative. We don't know what that means, but it is fair to say that over the last couple of thousand years, they have enslaved the Jews more than what was normative. That I think is fair to say. And therefore, there are many, many who have discussed this Gemara who say, Pashat, these oaths are interdependent. Yeah, there's three oaths, but they're interdependent on one another. We're not supposed to rebel against the nations. The first two oaths, not to go up these Eretz Yisrael B'Chazak, not to rebel against the nations, basically not to go against the nations, and the nations are not supposed to go too much against us when we're in Golas. Well, if they violated it, so we can violate it. Just to mention that there are those that disagree with this reading of the Gemara there, Kufir Aleph. You look in the Maral, the Netzach Yisrael, Paragraph Daled. You look in the Avos Yonasan of Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz and Paras Baschanan. You look in Shamshval Hirsch's Chayrev and the English translation by Isidor Grunfeld on page 609. And if you look in these sources, including Vayol Moshe, Samarav, a few places in Vayol Moshe, including page 90, page 105, again and again, they all mention that the oaths are not interdependent. Just because the Goyim have mistreated the Jews doesn't mean that we have the right to rebel against the nations. They hold that these oaths are not interdependent one to the other. Good. If you look in the Shita Mekubetzes there in Ksubis, the Shita Mekubetzes in Ksubis brings down the Talmidei Rashba. The Shita Mekubetzes says that if the non-Jews will act inappropriately to us, meaning they violate their oath, then Hashem will bring a Yeshua to the Jewish people not in its proper time. That if they violate their oath, Hashem will bring Yeshua to the Jewish people not in its proper time, which of course may help explain some of the events of 75, 80 years ago, how one led to the other. All right, we have to move on. Says, so this is just one aspect of this Gemara. I should point out that we have not seen the full extent of it. You're looking at the Taisa Shantz. The Taisa Shantz over here says, well, one second. This Gemara is mashma that the Shavua of Avimelech is no longer because the descendants of Avimelech were fighting with the descendants of Yitzchak, the descendants of Avram. So if they're fighting, then the Shavua is no longer. That means that the oaths were interdependent with one another. If that's the case, then how is it that Rashi in the Navi, Rashi tells us that when it came to fighting with the city of Yevusi, Yehuda wasn't married, right? Binyam, they're not married to the city of Yevus, which is in between. And later on in Shmuel and Divrei Yamim, David buys the granary of Arnava in order to be able to build a Beis Hamikdash because they couldn't take the city by force. What do you mean they couldn't do it by force? Why not? The Rashi over there says because the Yevusi of the descendants from Avimelech. But isn't the Shua gone? That's the Taisa Shant's question. So the first thing just to mention is that it's very difficult to substantiate Rashi. The city of Yevus is most likely related to Yevusi. And Yevusi is what? One of the Zion Umais. Nothing to do with the Plishtim. So that's the most fundamental problem with this. And the second is, if they were related to Plishtim, doesn't this Gemara make it clear that there's no more Shua because it's interdependent? So the Shashans answers that you have to say the Krechzig into Rashi. It's not so clear that Rashi is actually saying this in the Navi, but Shashans at least would want to read Rashi to basically say that we're basing it upon a different kind of an oath. We're talking about another oath that Avram took, and this oath was as part of the purchase of the Maris Machpelah. Maris Machpelah doesn't say Yavusi over there. What is Ephraim? Ephraim is Achiti. So it's not the Yavusi, it's a different nation. Nevertheless, he wants to make the argument that based upon the Pirkei of Rebbe Lezer, that there was some sort of an oath that Avram took when he bought Chevron, which Chevron is not Yerushalayim. I don't know how to make that make work better, but whatever it was, some sort of an oath that Avram took with Ephraim Achiti, which somehow connects to Yevusi, which somehow connects to Yerushalayim, and that Avram wasn't going to attack. And that's the oath that remained, and that's the reason that the Jewish people weren't able to hit the city of Yevus when they later on came to conquer it. All right, we'll have to leave that there. Continues the Gemara. So the pasuk tells us another pasuk there. Vayigdal hanar vayevaracheu Hashem. That the child grew up and Hashem blessed him. B'ma baruchu, how did Hashem bless this child? Amar Buddha Amarav Shabaruchu ba'amasei. He was blessed ba'ama. Right. I'm not explaining any more what that means, but I should tell you that the Mefarshim, the Ben Yayada here, others, they want to use this in a very Kabbalistic sense. The Tzitzis of Kedusha dealt, with the things that they mention. Ainly Asik Nistarm, I don't really understand any of that stuff. So what we'll say is as follows. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Amasa Kibnei Adam. His Amma was like a normal person's. However, but he was so virile that what came out of it was unbelievable, like spring. We'll see in the Gemara in a few minutes what I think this actually connects to in Chazal's mind. In other words, forgetting the Tzedek Kedusha and Mekubalim and all of this kind of stuff, but I think there is a very simple reading up to how Chazal the Psukim. Like I said, we'll come to it in a minute, but the basic idea is that the Shimshon was viewed as unbelievable supernatural character. As I mentioned already yesterday, there's no clear indication that he had any physical superhuman strength. It seems all to have been, some sort of spiritual thing that when he had a moment, all of a sudden he had this superhuman strength, but it came from a moment. It wasn't like he was Mr. Universe. That said, everyone was terrified of him and his superhuman feats, and so when he was in jail, Chazal and make a drasha that people brought their wives to him to become pregnant, so they should have these superhuman, children who would be also endowed with this incredible strength. And that's perhaps what this is a reference to. There's nothing more. Vayikra Shimshon Hashem. Shimshon at the end of his life calls out to Hashem. This is on the last day of his life when the Plishtim are all parading and partying and having a good time at his expense by the fact that he's blinded and he can no longer access the strength that he once had. And he says to Hashem, please Hashem, remember me one more time, give me one more time the strength that I had. And let me take a revenge. One of my eyes to the Plishtim. Meaning the other eyes, the schus will be for Elam Haba, but for one of the eyes that he got gouged out, he wants to be able to have his reward now, to be able to take revenge against the Plishtim. Not at his own expense, at his own life. We don't have time to get into now whether or not this kind of a suicide is permitted. This is a very big topic. Chazal, we don't have time to discuss. So what happened? Amar Rav, Amar Shimshon Tzedek Baruch Hu, Rebbeinu Shalom. Zechor li esrim shtayim shon sheshafati es Yisrael. Shimshon says to Hashem, remember the 20, in my Gemara, it puts in parentheses, the Shtayim to 22 years, because the Pasuk only says that he judged the Jewish people for 20 years. But, and the Rashba, if you look on the side of the Gemara, it brings down the Chuvas of Rashba, it's in Beiches, that it doesn't have it in his Gemara that it said 2. But if you look in the Yerushalmi in Sotah says that he judged the Jewish people for 20 years, and he judged the Jewish people for 40 years. Moshe already points out, and never says in Pasuk 40 years. What's the Yerushalmi talking about? It only says 20 years. So the Moshe wants to answer a beautiful answer, and Moshe's answer is, it says in the Pasuk 2 times that Shimshon judged the Jewish people for 20 years. Why did I say it two times? To tell you that's true. He judged Jewish people for 20 years. But after he died, his fear was so palpable among the Plishtim, and they didn't mess around with the Jewish people for another 20 years. So altogether, it was like a 40-year rule. If you look in the shaftim in the different places of different shaftim, sometimes they did judge for 40 years. Right? David HaMelech is the ruler of the Jews for like 40 years, 33 or so years, 33 and a half years in Hebron, and then, I'm sorry, 7.5 years in Hebron and 33 and a half years over the Jewish people as a whole. So 40 years was a round number that judges did. And Shimshon got to it by having the remaining fear that he had over the Pelishtim exist for another 20 years. If that's the case, says the Marsha, then the Girsa of Shtaim works beautifully because it says Esrim Ushtaim Shan doesn't mean 22. It means Esrim two times. The two times that it says Esrim is for 40 years. That's the Marsha's answer over here. I never asked anybody to say, get me a stick, bring my walking stick from place to place. You remember the Gemara Barachas Yud, where we talked about that. I wrote to Lehanas, Yana, Elisha, or wrote to Shmuel. We have different examples of people in Jewish tradition who never took anything from their flocks. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu says, Shmuel never took anything. He used to carry his tent around, so he shouldn't take anything from anybody. On the other hand, you have the Gemara of this says about Elisha, that Elisha took from the Shunamis, so you have Elio, his Rebbe, who also took. So you have different ways to go. But Shimshon took the approach of Shmuel, the approach of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he asked for nothing. He never even asked somebody to help him with his walking stick, to get him a favor, nothing, zero, he never asked. So he asked for Hashem to give him a schar, to let him go against the Pelishtim, the schar. They never was made on the Jewish people. He never asked the Jewish people to give him any honor, to give him any covet, do anything for him. Nothing. Shimshon went and remember the story there in Judges. He takes the 300 foxes, he ties them together, sets them on fire, and makes them all go crazy, and they burn all the fields down. So the Gemara says, "Mashna Shualam, why did he doing the foxes?" Amar Rabbi Abiyeba Bar Negdi, Amar Rav Chiya Bar Abba, Amar Shimshon Yavi. So Shimshon said, "Yavi Misha Chayzel Achayra V'Yipar Misha Plish Misha Chazu B'Shrosa." And again, I don't know if this is scientifically correct, but Chazal understood that foxes are not like other animals. Now, when you attack a fox, maybe other animals as well, but a fox specifically, it doesn't run away. When you're going after a fox, it backs away, right? To be able to keep its eyes on the thing that's going to attack it, it tries to back away and watch what's going on, rather than turning tail and running backwards. So if that's the case, then Shimshon was taking the foxes, so the thing that runs backwards should go be Perea from the Pelishtim who went against their Shua. Since they went backwards in terms of lying about their oath, so he's alluding to that by having the foxes. Tanya Amar Shimon HaChassid, one of three places in Shas we find Shimon HaChassid. The Tolas Tanaim Amoraim tells us that this is not to be confused with Shimon Chasida. That's an Amor. This is Shimon HaChassid, a Tana. Three times in Shas is mentioned, always with regards to I got it once a cool, once a giga. Yeah, so Shimon HaChassid says, "Bank safe of Shal Shimshon Shishim Amahaya." Between the shoulders of Shimshon was 60 amma. What does it mean? It was a huge person, obviously, if this is to be taken literally. But the pasuk says, "Shenem Avishkav Shimshon Lechatzia Laila." Right, when Shimshon had gone to be in one of the with the Zaina, so they thought they were going to be able to attack him in the morning. So Shimshon got up, however, in the middle of the night. Chatzia Laila got up at Chatzos, and he surprised everyone. So what did he do? He took the doorpost, the doorways, the gates of Gaza, and put them on his shoulders. We have learned that the gates of Gaza were not less than 60 amos. So obviously, if he's picking them up, taking them on his shoulders, then he must have been 60 amos. I don't see the connection. The gates of Gaza could be 60 amos, but if he has superhuman strength, he could be a little yeshiva, lemala, and he can still carry gates that are 60 amos. It doesn't have to be 60 amos. Okay, not sure. Anyhow, the pasuk continues. This is a pasuk there from the end of his life. That Shimshon was put to work after they gouged out his eyes. He was put to work grinding, essentially being made to work as a mill, as a hand in the shops that they used to have to be able to grind things. They had to use the water as a source of power. That's what he did. He said they didn't have water as a source of power. They had human beings. They had chamarim. They had horses. They would just basically go around grinding again and again and again. So that was what his job was, essentially as a slave. So Rabbi Yochanan ain't techina el lashon avera. No, when it says over here, grinding is a lashon of avera, meaning it's a lashon of a euphemistic lashon for intimacy. Techenu omer titcha la'achar ishti, which the pasuk says there in Eiv that somebody is going to be taken after his wife. Everybody brought their wives to be able to be nisa'aba from Shimshon because of the fact that they wanted their children to be endowed with these incredible strength. Again, as I said, that might be the connection to what we said before about being Bercha Ba'ama. Amra Papa Hainu Amri Inchi Kame Deshasa Chamra Kame Refuke Greda Duvla. As it relates to the kinds of a person, if you have a drunk, you're going to give him wine. Yeah, you're going to have somebody who's a farmer, you're going to give him vegetables. So the a person goes after what they're like, and that's over here in this kind of a situation. We're not saying this in the most complimentary way, but we're saying effectively that given the situations of him sort of running after his eyes, this was put in front of him as well. Anybody who's mizana himself, his wife's going to mizana also. Again, a pasuk in Eiv, right? The pasuk says that if he would be mizana on his wife, so then uksiv titchan lachar ishti, that's a reference to those his wife being mizana. And others, sort of crouching over her. So that's again a proof to this idea that if the husband is mizana, the wife will also be mizana as well. Is what it means when people say he's with the pumpkins and she's with the zucchinis. In other words, the basic premise over here is, like for like. You're going to act in an appropriate way. She's going to act in an appropriate way. And again, in reference to Shimshon, that he may have, been acting inappropriately, and so therefore he was brought to act inappropriately at the end as well. Let's just try to finish up a little bit more. Shimshon judged the Jewish people like the Father in heaven, like Hashem. But the pasuk says that Yaakov says about Shimshon, he's going to judge the people like one of the Shvatim. Shimshon is called, as it were, by the name of Hashem. Like, what does it even mean? Hashem Hashem is like the Shemesh Shemagin, is like the protector of the Jewish people. But you see, Shemesh Shimshon is like a sort of a connection between Shemesh and Shimshon, and therefore, since Shemesh is put with Hashem, so therefore Shimshon is like the word of Hashem. So the Gemara says, "Well, so maybe you shouldn't erase the name of Shimshon." So the Gemara answers, no, it's not exactly the name of Hashem. It's like the name of Hashem, just like Hashem watches over the world. So too Shimshon watched over the Jewish people. I should point out that Taisus mentions over here, what about the word Shalom? Shalom is also considered like a name of Hashem. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us like a name of Hashem. You shouldn't be giving Shalom in the Beis HaMerchatz. So the Taisus answers, maybe that's a ton of a shear, because in Masechet Seifrim we don't mention Shalom as one of the names of Hashem that you can't erase. Maybe it's a bit of a ton of a shear. Fine, but Shimshon, in the end, we come out and say the Shimshon is not a name of Hashem, and therefore Shimshon would be allowed to be erased if you actually wrote it down. Let's just get to the two dots. I mentioned this already before, that Bilam was a chigar, he was a lame in one foot. Right after he got his foot stamped on by the wall, right? Remember the donkey is taking him and scratching his foot on the wall, so he becomes lame. So Shimshon chigar b'shnei raglim, and maybe Shimshon was a chigar. He was lame in two legs. Right, he was in the pasuk there in Parashat Vayechi, that when Yaakov is comparing him to the serpent, so he used the word shefi, but double shefi fun, like 2 times shefi. So he was really, really lame, and therefore that would be an indication that he was acting in superhuman strength. Again, as we said from the Maharsha, Mishalmi, that would be comparable to a serpent because he had no use of his legs, and that would show you how much more superhuman the feats were that he was able to do. I'll stop here.